Margaret stood at the edge of her property line and watched the dust devils dance across the barren field. 3 years ago, this land had been green, productive, full of promise. Her husband Robert had worked it with the kind of devotion most men reserved for religion, coaxing crops from soil that others said was too difficult. He'd understood something about this land that Margaret had never fully grasped. He'd known when to plant and when to let it rest, when to irrigate and when to let nature take its course. Under his care, their 40 acres had supported them comfortably, had even generated enough surplus to save for their future. Then Robert had died, suddenly and without warning, his heart simply stopping one afternoon while he was checking the irrigation ditches. Margaret had been 46 years old, married for 23 years, and completely unprepared to manage a working farm alone. She'd tried. God knew she'd tried. She'd followed Robert's notes, had asked advice from neighboring farmers, had worked from dawn until exhaustion every single day. But something fundamental was wrong. The crops came in smaller each season. The soil seemed to be dying, losing its vitality with each passing month. Now, standing here looking at fields that should have been planted weeks ago but remained empty because Margaret didn't know what would even grow in this depleted earth, she felt the weight of failure pressing down on her shoulders. She was going to lose this land. The bank had already sent 2 letters warning that the mortgage was in arrears. Her savings were gone. She had no family to turn to, no children to help shoulder the burden. At 49 years old, Margaret was staring at the very real possibility of losing everything Robert had built and becoming destitute. The shame of it was almost worse than the practical reality. Robert had trusted her to preserve his legacy, and she was failing him. The sound of a horse approaching broke through her spiral of despair. Margaret turned to see a rider coming up the road, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. As he drew closer, she could make out a man in his mid-50s, weathered by sun and work, with the easy posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. He tipped his hat as he approached and introduced himself as Nathan Cole, recently arrived from New Mexico, where he'd been working various ranches for the past decade. Margaret nodded politely, but didn't invite conversation. She'd learned to be wary of drifters and strangers, especially men who might see a widow alone as an opportunity rather than a person. But Nathan didn't push. He simply asked if she knew of any work in the area, said he was looking for a place to settle for a season or two, that he had experience with difficult land and livestock. Margaret was about to say no when something made her pause. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the way he looked at her land with interest rather than pity. Maybe it was simple loneliness finally overcoming caution. She told him the truth. She said her land was dying and she didn't know how to save it. She said she couldn't afford to hire help, that she could barely afford to feed herself. She said that if he was looking for paying work, he should move on to one of the larger operations. Nathan listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he asked if he could walk the property, just look at the soil and the irrigation system. He said he wouldn't charge anything for his opinion, and if she didn't find his assessment useful, he'd move on with no hard feelings. Margaret agreed, mostly because she had nothing left to lose. They walked the 40 acres together, Nathan stopping frequently to examine the soil, to check the irrigation ditches, to look at the remnants of last season's failed crops. He asked questions about Robert's methods, about what had changed since his death, about the sequence of crops and the timing of plantings. Margaret answered as best she could, though she realized as she spoke how little she actually understood about what Robert had been doing. After 2 hours of inspection, Nathan delivered his assessment. He said the land wasn't dying. It was exhausted. Robert had been an excellent farmer, but he'd been pushing the soil too hard, planting the same crops in the same rotation without giving the earth time to recover its nutrients. The irrigation system was also working against them, delivering water at the wrong times and in the wrong amounts. The land needed rest, renewal, and a completely different approach. Nathan said it could be saved, but it would take at least 2 full seasons of careful management and probably 3 before it would be fully productive again. Margaret felt tears forming, though she fought them back. 2 or 3 seasons meant 2 or 3 more years of barely surviving, of falling further behind on the mortgage, of watching her money run out. She didn't have 2 or 3 seasons. She had maybe 6 months before the bank foreclosed. Nathan seemed to understand this without her saying it. He made a proposal that seemed insane in its generosity. He said he would work her land for room and board only, no wages. He said he had some savings and didn't need money immediately. He said he'd been drifting for 10 years since his own wife died, and he was tired of moving from place to place. He wanted to stay somewhere, to put his knowledge to use, to feel like his work mattered. If Margaret would let him try to restore her land, he'd ask nothing in return except a place to sleep and meals. Margaret's first instinct was suspicion. Men didn't offer to work for free without expecting something in return. But looking at Nathan's face, she saw no calculation or hidden motive. She saw only a kind of weary hope, the look of someone who needed purpose as much as she needed help. Against her better judgment, she agreed to let him try. Nathan moved into the small bunkhouse that Robert had built years ago for seasonal workers. He started work the next morning before dawn, and Margaret soon realized that he approached farming with a philosophy completely different from Robert's. Where Robert had believed in constant productivity, Nathan believed in strategic rest. He plowed under half the fields and planted them with clover, which he said would restore nitrogen to the soil. He adjusted the irrigation schedule, allowing water to soak deep rather than providing frequent shallow watering. He taught Margaret about crop rotation, about companion planting, about reading the soil's needs rather than imposing a rigid schedule. The work was hard and the changes were radical. Margaret found herself having to trust Nathan's expertise, even when his methods contradicted everything Robert had done. It felt like a betrayal sometimes, changing Robert's carefully developed systems. But as the weeks passed and she saw the clover growing thick and green, saw the soil beginning to recover its dark richness, she started to believe that maybe Nathan knew what he was doing. They fell into a routine. Nathan would work the fields and manage the irrigation. Margaret would handle the kitchen garden, the chickens, and the household. They'd eat meals together, and Nathan would explain what he'd done that day and why. He never talked down to her or suggested she couldn't understand. He taught her patiently, answering her questions, showing her how to read the signs that the land itself provided. Slowly, Margaret began to learn not just the mechanics of farming, but the deeper understanding that Robert had possessed, but never fully shared with her. As summer turned to fall, something else began to develop between them. It started as mutual respect, a recognition that they were both competent people who'd suffered losses. It deepened into friendship, built on shared meals and conversations that ranged from farming techniques to life philosophies. Margaret found herself looking forward to Nathan's presence, to his quiet competence, to the way he made her feel capable rather than helpless. Nathan seemed to find something similar in their arrangement. He'd told her once that after his wife died, he'd lost the ability to imagine a future beyond the next job, the next town. Working Margaret's land had given him something to care about again. The first real test came when winter arrived and the bank sent its final notice. Margaret would need to make a substantial payment by spring or face foreclosure. She'd been putting off this conversation with Nathan, ashamed to admit how dire her financial situation truly was. But one evening over dinner, she finally told him everything. She said that despite all his work and her new understanding, they wouldn't have a harvest to sell until late next summer. The bank wouldn't wait that long. She'd lose the land before they could prove that Nathan's methods worked. Nathan was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said he had savings that he'd been accumulating over his years of drifting. He said he'd been planning to eventually buy his own small place somewhere, but he'd come to realize that this land felt more like home than anywhere he'd been in a decade. He offered to pay off the mortgage arrears, not as a loan, but as an investment. He said if she'd be willing, he'd like to become her partner in the farm, to share both the work and the ownership. Margaret was stunned. This went far beyond the arrangement they'd agreed to. This was Nathan offering to tie his future to hers, to commit his resources to saving her land. She asked him why he'd do such a thing for someone he'd only known for a few months. Nathan's answer was simple and honest. He said that for 10 years he'd been half alive, going through the motions of existing without actually living. Working this land with her had woken something in him that he'd thought died with his wife. He said he wanted to build something again, to have a purpose, to be part of something that lasted. He said that if she'd have him, not just as a farmhand but as a true partner, he'd consider himself fortunate. Margaret realized as he spoke that she'd been falling in love with this quiet man who'd arrived at her lowest moment and offered hope without asking for anything in return. She'd been fighting the feeling, convinced that loving anyone after Robert would be a betrayal. But sitting across from Nathan, seeing the genuine care in his eyes, she understood that love wasn't a finite resource that could only be given once. Robert had taught her about farming and partnership and commitment. Nathan was teaching her that those lessons could be applied again, differently, but just as meaningfully with someone new. She said yes to his offer. They became partners officially, splitting the ownership of the land and the work equally. Over the following 2 years, as Nathan's methods proved their worth and the harvests came in strong, they became partners in every other sense as well. They married in the spring of the 3rd year, a simple ceremony in town with a few neighbors as witnesses. By then, the land was blooming again, more productive than it had been even under Robert's care, because Nathan's approach was gentler and more sustainable. They worked that land together for another 20 years. Margaret learned everything Nathan could teach her and added her own innovations. They expanded carefully, bought adjacent property, and established a reputation for producing the highest quality crops in the region. They never had children, but they took on young people as apprentices, teaching them the methods that had saved Margaret's failing farm. They built something that was greater than either could have created alone. When Nathan died at 76, peacefully in his sleep after a long and satisfying life, Margaret grieved him deeply. But she didn't bury a ring or decide that her life was over. She continued working the land for another 5 years until her own health began to fail. When she finally sold the farm to one of their former apprentices, it was with the satisfaction of knowing that she'd taken land that was dying and helped it bloom again. More than that, she'd taken her own life, which had felt dead and purposeless after Robert's death, and had allowed it to bloom as well. Nurtured by a man who'd understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is not rescue but partnership. Years after both Nathan and Margaret had passed, the land they'd saved continued to produce abundant harvests. The apprentices they'd trained spread Nathan's methods across the territory, teaching other farmers about sustainable practices and patient cultivation. And people told the story of the widow whose land was dying, and the cowboy who'd helped it bloom, not through domination or force, but through understanding, patience, and love.